Hello, this slideshow is for IB history students. It's for those of you studying the higher level paper 3 for Africa and the Middle East. And this is about the Middle East since 1945, and we're focusing in on the Iran case study and looking at the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran between 1941 and 1979. The two pictures here are from his coronation in 1967, sort of blinged out decadence, and then of course the Iranian Revolution that overthrows the Shah in 1979. The students that I work with use the Cleveland reading, the Cleveland textbook, A History of the Modern Middle East, and they did some pre-reading from pages 288 to 293. You can probably find this information out from a couple of other sources though, depending on what books you have. For personality, think a little bit about the youth and the growing up of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Remember, he's sent to boarding school in Switzerland and spends his whole time pretty much in love with Western ideas, and that will of course be one of the challenges that he faces later. As far as the impact of World War II on Iran, remember that his father, Reza Shah, had done a lot to get rid of Russian and British influence. The Russians go of their own accord after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, although still maintain heavy interests. And the British, of course, are filling in the space left by the Russians. And Reza works pretty hard to try and remove and reduce that influence. He's abdicated in 1941. There's a concern, remember, that he was leaning sort of too close to Nazi Germany, and the excuse that the Soviet Union and the British used for moving into Iran during World War II is, of course, securing Iran's oil supplies. Mohammad Mossadegh is the politician that comes through in this later period. After the Second World War, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi is really working as a constitutional monarch. The Majlis, the Iranian parliament, is the lawmaking body, and Mohammad Mossadegh is the politician that kind of appears and pops up in that. He does spend some time in and out of jail in the 1930s. He's in opposition to Reza Shah's authoritarianism, and he's definitely a politician that has a good reputation for integrity. Throughout the late 1940s, he's been campaigning against foreign influence in Iran, and with lots of popular support, by 1951, he's been able, with cooperation of other members of the Majlis, to organise the nationalisation of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And you might remember, if you studied Reza Shah, that by 1933, even though Reza Shah had renegotiated the terms of the oil settlement, perhaps not to Iran's favour. But after 1951, there's a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil that is kind of very much encouraged by the British government, and the United States joins that same boycott by 1952. That really plunges Iran into a kind of economic crisis and a sort of a power struggle between the Shah and the Majlis there. The 1953 coup, we'll come back to that in a little bit, so keep listening. So there's a really useful video here which gives you, if you're looking to include perspectives in your higher level paper essays, from the British Newsday Pathé, and it's a couple of minutes of a contemporary news report about the 1953 coup, and it's well worth watching to the end. The last couple of minutes really give you a clue about how the British see the whole situation in Iran and the idea of British entitlement to the Iranian oil profits there. So that's worth a watch, and that will help you add in to those sort of perspectives, those concepts that you're looking for IB history. The coup itself in 1953 is really sponsored a little bit by the US and Britain at the start, and they kind of get more and more involved as it goes on. Remember, there's a diverse political opposition in Iran. The Tudeh, T-U-D-E-H, is the Iranian Communist Party, and unusually perhaps in Iran, those communists, and the Tudeh in particular, are centred around middle-class urban Iranians rather than working-class Iranians. There's a fear that perhaps Mossadegh, and some historians and some interpretations suggested he's kind of a little bit out of his depth. He's kind of this man of moral and principle, sort of stuck in this seething mass of politics. With the Shah's encouragement and with the help of the army and General Zahedi, Z-A-H-E-D-I, the Shah dismisses Mossadegh. If the first coup fails, Mossadegh's supporters come out onto the streets in the middle of August, but by the 19th of August, America and Britain have put some money in some people's pockets, and with a bit more encouragement, people are now opposed to Mossadegh. There will be no martyrdom or sort of execution for Mossadegh. He dies under house arrest. The Shah comes back from the sort of first coup where he failed to the second coup where he's now successful to be restored. Oil ownership is redistributed. It doesn't go back to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in its previous form, and Iran now gets 50% of the profits as opposed to the 20% they were receiving before. And of course, with the rising oil prices throughout the Shah's time in power, that will certainly help him live a pretty good life. And of course, with that US help to restore the Shah's power comes a continued influence of the US in Iranian policy from that time. The Shah will also deal pretty harshly with the groups that opposed him during this time period. The National Front, the political organisation that Mossadegh used, is disbanded. The security forces of the Shah will make really strong efforts to get rid of the Tudeh party, and the Shah will certainly use his secret police to try and enforce what's going on. It's the oil settlement that is really important in Iran and will be the basis of Iran's economy throughout this time period. And having a look at the little chart there, you can see how important oil is to Iran and its earnings. And you can see that by 1979, 90% of Iran's income comes from oil. Iran is also a big spender in military equipment, and that's also more important in terms of what's going on. And actually, over time, the Iranians will not just buy American weapons, they'll look for French, Chinese, and Russian weapons. So they're kind of diversifying their spending in order to kind of increase support. Oxenwald points out in the history of the Middle East, there's also seemingly limitless quantities of natural gas. Iran joins OPEC in 1960, and and OPEC's aims is to coordinate oil policies. It doesn't have a lot of influence, and the Shah begins to play a leading role, particularly as OPEC grows over the 1960s and 70s in membership. And the Shah actually plays a leading role in kind of managing OPEC in terms of being convinced that the West had had cheap oil for far too long. So I think in that sense, there's an opportunity for you to bring out perhaps a little counter-argument. The Shah certainly isn't the sort of lapdog or poodle of the West. He's also looking really to improve Iran's chances. Of course, with the 1973 war, the oil price nearly quadruples from $3 a barrel in 1972 to $11.65 by the end of 1973. During the 1973 war, Iran did not join the Arab states in their reduction of oil production, and their income and production grew as well. Iran really will use its oil money to become a regional power, pushing back against the influence of the Soviet Union in particular. But the Iranians do also have some problems. They don't necessarily effectively have these skilled engineers yet to manage the sort of infrastructure of the oil refineries and so on. They start a nuclear program in the 1960s. And the other big issue, and of course this will be one of the things that really contributes to the downfall of the Shah in the end, is that Iran's oil wealth is not really well distributed to ordinary people. Most of it stayed with the Shah and his family and those with court connections. And many of Iran's rural poor, about half the population, barely see any benefits from the oil. But having said all that, the Shah does get it. Although he's spending money very recklessly, he does understand that oil is a finite resource and he is trying to plan accordingly. However, there's only so much investment that could be absorbed. And urban dwellers really benefit the most. There are improvements for housing, sanitation, and those types of things. But also the abundance of government money means that corruption grows, particularly amongst bureaucrats. So a really mixed report, but probably the key takeaway is that the wealth income isn't really distributed very wisely. And as you can see here, Iran is spending huge amounts of money on military expenditure with its aim to become a regional power. The political system, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi is really reinforced by the 1953 coup. He will return to Iran at the end of August, and he will appoint General Zahedi as prime minister, but pretty soon he's really running Iran as an authoritarian state. There are elections in the late 1950s. The way that they manage the candidate lists for the 1956 elections ensures that it's conservative landowners, people of tradition, that will get into power. The 1962 White Revolution is really important, and there has been specific questions about this in the past on the IB paper, so you do need to make sure that you're clear on that and what it means. It's implemented by the Shah to bring modernization and political reforms. There's 19 different programs focusing on land reform, breaking up of large estates, religious foundations, water resources, health improvements, literacy. The franchise and the right to vote is extended to women, and polygamy is restricted. But to be honest, there isn't a lot of choice in political parties. The running joke in Iran that there were sort of two organisations called the Yes Party and the Yes Sir Party. So there isn't a lot of choice. The White Revolution is held up as a referendum piece. It gets 95% approval, and it generally gets widespread support at the time from Western educated liberals and from poor people in the villages who thought they would initially benefit. And the Shah really does restrict the constitution, and there's high levels of repression throughout this time period. Iran is well on its way with the rising oil prices of the late 60s and 70s, and it looks like economic prices and the economic promises of the White Revolution would come good for Iran. The Shah supervises all aspects of the government, and he believed he had a stable regime. He effectively uses the secret police. It's called the SAVAK, and there are pretty horrendous tales of torture and repression held by them. He controls the judiciary, and he's kind of whizzing around living a fine life. And you can certainly find out more about his sort of feast of the last 25 centuries in 1971, where he spends over $100 million on a sort of party to sort of celebrate Persian heritage and, of course, himself as the Shah. Foreign policy-wise, he generally enjoys pretty good terms with the USA, hardly surprising. Jimmy Carter, when he becomes the president in 1977, begins to emphasize human rights issues with his foreign policy, and that will encourage some sort of softish criticism of Iran. The USA will continue to train Iran's secret police and intelligence agencies through this time period, and even though Iran's making pots of money from the oil industry, they'll still receive military aid from the US. Some of the Western powers are kind of half hoping that Iran would become some kind of Gulf policeman and manage the kind of oil-rich areas of the Gulf. The Shah begins this with a sort of positive nationalism foreign policy, a strong alliance with the Americans. He just joined the Baghdad Treaty in 1955. Those of you that have studied NASA will know, of course, NASA does not. But by 1963, the Shah is beginning to sort of question that sort of devotion to the USA and perhaps begins to develop a more independent national policy and looking to build its role as a regional power. Religious and ethnic differences will continue to mean poor relations with the Arab states. Relations with Iraq are generally fairly poor. They're often arguing over the Shatt al-Arab waterway border. However, I mean, of course, that will cause conflicts in the future, as you know. And a couple of times they sever diplomatic relationships, and there's a couple of times when Iraq will deport Iranians from Karbala and the Najaf, important Shia holy sites, and the Shah will support Kurds as they rebel against the Iraqis in Iraq. There's a settlement in 1975 that does seem to improve relationships regarding the sort of territorial claims on the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Relationships in the Gulf are generally fairly steady. There's a couple of islands, the Abu Musa and Tumb Islands, which Iran has claimed. Iran used to also claim Bahrain. It relinquished that claim in 1970 and seized these islands in the Gulf. Protests from the UAE have really gotten nowhere since. With the rest of the world, as I said earlier, they're spending money on military weapons with China and the Soviet Union, spending $11 billion on American equipment. And by 1976, Iran's army was the 5th largest in the world. So I'm going to press pause there, and I'll tell you a little bit more about social changes and the lead up to the revolution in the second part. Thanks for listening.